The morning the debt collector came to Willow Creek began like any other, until the sound of hooves echoed down the dusty road leading to the Hale farm. Elias Grant rode tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a worn duster, the brim of his hat shadowing a face hardened by years of work and loss. He wasn't a cruel man, but life on the plains had taught him to be firm. He'd loaned Thomas Hale money the previous spring, enough to buy seed and tools for the year's planting, and had done so on trust alone. But the harvest had failed, and Elias couldn't afford sentiment. Winter was coming, and his ranch hands expected wages. If debts weren't settled, the Grant Ranch itself could suffer. As he approached the Hale homestead, Elias expected anger, maybe deceit. Instead, he found silence. The farmhouse sagged like a tired old soul, its paint peeled and porch broken. In the yard, a thin young woman knelt beside a chicken coop, her hands raw from work. When she heard the horse, she straightened, wiping sweat from her brow, and looked up at him with cautious eyes the color of cornflowers. Clara Hale, Thomas's daughter. Elias dismounted, his boots stirring dust. "I'm looking for Thomas Hale," he said, his voice calm but direct. Clara's gaze flickered toward the house. "My father's inside," she answered softly. "He's been sick since the harvest failed." Her words were polite, but her hands trembled as she gripped her apron. Inside, the air smelled of sickness and despair. Thomas Hale lay on a narrow bed, skin pale and breath shallow. When Elias spoke his name, the man stirred weakly, recognizing his creditor at once. "You've come for what I owe," he rasped, guilt and shame in his eyes. Elias didn't deny it. He had to collect, yet the sight before him tugged at something deep and reluctant. "I'll give you more time," Elias began, but Thomas shook his head. "There's no more time, son. The land's taken everything from us." His gaze shifted to Clara, who stood near the door, clutching the edge of her apron like a shield. "She's all I have left. I can't see her go hungry when I'm gone." Clara stepped forward. "Please," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We can work something out. I'll find a way to repay you." Her cheeks flushed with humiliation, yet her chin lifted with determination. Elias, who had faced storms, loss, and betrayal, found himself unsettled by the quiet courage of this fragile-looking woman. She wasn't pleading. She was promising. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the bare trees. Elias looked around at the failing farm, the empty barn, the broken fence, the silent fields. It was hopeless. No crop, no livestock, no way to repay a cent. Logic told him to write off the debt or take what little property remained. But when he looked at Clara, her threadbare dress, her dirt-streaked face, the way she stood like she might collapse yet refused to fall, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He tipped his hat and said, "I'll think on it." But as he mounted his horse, his mind was already made. She'd work for the debt. He'd bring her to his ranch where she could earn her father's due with dignity. It would be fair, practical. And though he didn't admit it, it would ease the tightness in his chest he felt every time he saw her trying to stand against the ruin around her. As he rode away, Clara watched him disappear into the horizon, unaware that the man who had come to collect a debt would soon change the course of her life and his own forever. For 2 sleepless nights after Elias Grant's visit, Clara Hale felt the weight of his coming return pressing on her chest. She knew he would. Men like him, ranchers with responsibility and pride, didn't make idle threats or empty promises. The debt her father owed was real, and the world did not forgive poverty. Still, when she saw him ride back into the yard on the 3rd morning, dust swirling around his horse's hooves, she straightened her back and wiped her palms on her apron. Fear would not show. Not today. Elias dismounted, his expression unreadable. He removed his hat respectfully when he spoke, his deep voice gentler than before. "Miss Hale, I've thought about your father's debt." The words made her stomach twist. She braced herself for the blow that he would demand the farm, or worse, that the sheriff would come to take her father away. But what came next was something she hadn't expected. "I can't take your home," Elias said firmly, "and I won't see your father jailed over a debt he meant to pay, but I have men to feed and wages due. I'll offer you a bargain." Clara blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "A bargain?" You'll come to my ranch, he said, his gaze steady, and work for the winter season. Room and board will be provided. Your wages will go toward what your father owes me. By spring, the debt will be settled. For a long moment, Clara couldn't speak. Leave her home? Leave her father, who could barely stand. Her heart pounded painfully. You mean, she whispered, as your servant? Elias's jaw tightened at the word. As a worker, he corrected. You'll be treated fair, same as anyone else on my land. Her father stirred weakly from the bed, hearing enough to understand. Clara, he said, his voice raspy, take it. You'll be safer there than starving here. She turned to him, tears pricking her eyes. But Papa, no, he said, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. You're strong. You'll manage. Mr. Grant's an honorable man. His gaze shifted to Elias as if making sure he meant it. You'll look after her? Elias nodded once solemnly. On my life. The moment sealed the agreement. Clara spent the rest of the day packing her few belongings. A faded shawl, a second dress, a worn Bible her mother had left behind. As she stood on the porch that evening, watching the sky turn pink and gold, she felt the ache of everything she was leaving behind. The smell of her father's pipe tobacco, the creak of the old rocking chair, the tiny patch of garden she'd coaxed to bloom despite the drought. Elias waited patiently by his horse, sensing her hesitation but saying nothing. He was a man of few words, and though his expression remained calm, he felt a strange pull in his chest as he watched her lock the door one final time. This was no ordinary act of debt repayment. This was a girl being torn from the only life she knew. When she climbed onto the wagon beside him, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. He flicked the reins, and they set off down the long road toward the Grant Ranch. For miles, neither spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the whisper of the wind through the grass. Finally, Elias said quietly, You'll find work enough to keep you busy. My housekeeper Martha will show you what's needed. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to answer. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, strange, open, and filled with possibilities she didn't dare imagine. Behind her, her father's farm disappeared into shadow. Ahead lay a life she hadn't chosen, with a man she barely knew, and yet beneath the sorrow, something fragile stirred, a flicker of trust, or maybe fate. As the stars began to appear, Elias glanced at her profile in the twilight, her face pale but proud. He didn't know it yet, but the bargain he'd made that day would become the turning point of both their lives. He'd come to settle a debt, but before spring arrived, he'd owe her something far greater, his heart. The Grant Ranch came into view just as the sun began to rise over the rolling plains, its rays spilling across golden grass and weathered fences. To Clara Hale, sitting silently beside Elias on the wagon seat, it looked like something from another world, vast, ordered, alive. She'd grown up on 10 struggling acres, where every field had been a battle and every harvest a prayer. Here the land itself seemed strong, pulsing with life and wealth. And yet, despite its beauty, the ranch felt intimidating. It was Elias's world, not hers. As they rolled into the yard, ranch hands looked up from their chores, curiosity flickering across their faces. Some tipped their hats politely. Others exchanged glances, whispering. A woman riding beside the boss was unusual enough, but a poor farmer's daughter brought in on a debt bargain? That would set tongues wagging for weeks. Elias noticed the looks but ignored them. He jumped down and offered his hand to Clara. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers small and cool against his calloused palm. For the briefest moment, their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, something neither dared name. A tall, broad-shouldered woman stepped out of the kitchen porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "So you're the new helper," she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. "Name's Martha Jennings. I run the kitchen and the house, and if you do what I say, we'll get along just fine." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said quickly, clutching her bundle of belongings. Elias gave Martha a short nod. "See that she's settled in? She'll be working toward her father's debt." Martha's sharp eyes softened when she caught the flicker of discomfort on Clara's face. "Don't you worry, dear. You'll earn your keep honest and fair." Inside, the ranch house was large but plain, wood floors polished smooth, walls lined with framed sketches of horses and cattle, a faint scent of pine and saddle soap. Martha showed her to a small room near the kitchen, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the barnyard. It was humble, but to Clara it felt like a palace. She unpacked her things carefully, setting her Bible on the nightstand like an anchor. Her days quickly filled with work. She rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast, biscuits, eggs, bacon for the men, then scrubbed floors, tended the garden, washed linens, and mended clothes until her hands ached. The rhythm of labor steadied her grief and gave her no time to dwell on the empty farmhouse she'd left behind. The ranch was alive with movement and sound, horses snorting, men shouting, the clang of tools, the low hum of life continuing. Elias rarely spoke to her during those first weeks, though she often felt his presence. Sometimes she'd catch him watching from the corral as she carried buckets or hung laundry, his expression unreadable. He told himself he was only making sure she was treated fairly, but the truth was less simple. There was something about her quiet endurance that stirred him, the way she smiled faintly when she thought no one saw, the way she thanked Martha for every kindness, the way her eyes softened when she looked at the animals. One afternoon, while she was gathering herbs by the fence, the wind lifted her hair and sent it tumbling around her face in a halo of sunlight. Elias, riding past, slowed his horse. For a heartbeat, he forgot himself. She turned then, startled to find him watching, and he quickly tipped his hat and rode on, leaving her flushed and confused. That night, as she lay in bed, Clara thought of his eyes, steady, kind, and far lonelier than she'd first realized. The ranch might have been filled with men and life, but there was a stillness about Elias Grant, a silence that whispered of wounds no one else could see. And though she tried to tell herself she was just a worker paying off her father's debt, her heart began to stir with something she didn't understand, something fragile and dangerous, like the first light breaking through storm clouds. By the time the first frost touched the valley, Clara Hale had become part of the daily rhythm of the Grant Ranch. She moved quietly through her work, polite to everyone, invisible when she could be. Yet her gentleness had a way of softening even the roughest corners of the ranch. The men stopped swearing when she passed. The barn cat, once half wild, now followed her everywhere. And though she never raised her voice, her quiet laughter began to weave itself into the ranch's heartbeat. But Elias Grant, the man who'd brought her there, remained a mystery. He spoke little and smiled less. When he gave orders, they were direct, never unkind, but distant, as though he carried a wall around him. Sometimes at dinner she'd glance up and find his eyes on her, watching, studying, and in those brief moments, something unspoken passed between them before he looked away. One cold morning, the first snow threatened. Clara rose before dawn to help Martha in the kitchen. She worked so quickly, she didn't notice the skillet handle resting over the flame. When she grabbed it, pain shot through her hand. She gasped, dropping it, the sound sharp enough to bring Elias running from the porch. "What happened?" he demanded, kneeling beside her. She tried to pull her hand away, embarrassed. "It's nothing, just clumsy of me. Let me see." His voice left no room for argument. His rough, calloused fingers turned her palm upward. The burn was angry red, already blistering. He fetched cool water and pressed a clean cloth against it. His touch was careful, almost reverent. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. When he finally met her eyes, his expression was unreadable. "You should have called for help." She tried to smile through the sting. "You've got a ranch to run, Mr. Grant. I can handle a little burn." He hesitated, then said softly, "You don't always have to handle everything alone. Miss Hale." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to answer, but before she could, Martha entered, breaking the moment like a stone shattering still water. Elias rose quickly, muttering that he'd check the fences, and left without another word. From that day on, the air between them changed. It wasn't spoken, but something invisible lingered, an awareness neither could shake. He started noticing small things, the way she hummed when she worked, the careful way she folded her apron, the way her eyes softened when she spoke to the horses. and she began to see beneath his silence the weight he carried, the loneliness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. One evening, a storm rolled in fast from the west. Clara ran to the barn to help secure the doors, but the wind caught them, slamming them shut behind her. The sky split open with lightning, rain hammering the roof. Moments later, the door jerked open and Elias stepped inside, soaked through, breathless from the wind. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, striding over. "The lightning could—" "I was trying to save the calf," she said, pointing toward a shivering animal huddled in the straw. Together they knelt beside it, covering it with burlap and straw. Thunder shook the ground, but for that brief moment, their hands brushed and time seemed to stop. When he looked up, her face was lit by the dim lantern light, hair damp, eyes wide. He felt a pull so strong it frightened him. He stood abruptly, brushing off his coat. "You should go inside," he said roughly. "It's not safe." She rose, trembling, not from cold but from the strange ache twisting in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, jaw tight. "You don't have to thank me." As they stood in the storm's fading rumble, both knew something between them had shifted forever. The rancher's armor, built from years of solitude and loss, had begun to crack, and through those cracks light was starting to find its way in. The storm passed, but it left behind more than puddles and broken branches. It left whispers. By dawn, the ranch hands were already murmuring about how the boss and the debt man's daughter had been trapped in the barn together. The story grew with each retelling. Some said he'd carried her out in his arms. Others claimed they'd been found holding each other. None of it was true, but gossip didn't care for truth. Clara Hale heard the first whispers while hanging laundry behind the kitchen. The words stung more than the wind. "She's got him wrapped around her little finger," one hand said. "No man gives that kind of attention for free." The laughter that followed cut deep, sharper than any knife. That night, Clara folded her apron with trembling fingers, wondering if she should leave. She had come to the ranch to pay a debt, not to become a burden, or worse, a scandal. But when she looked out the window toward the fields, she saw Elias Grant crossing the yard, his broad shoulders bowed beneath the fading sunset. He moved like a man carrying something heavy inside, and against her will, her heart softened again. Elias, for his part, had heard the talk too. Men on the range had long tongues and short tempers, but this was different. Every whispered word about Clara felt like a personal insult. She worked harder than anyone, never complained, never sought attention, and yet they twisted her kindness into shame. It gnawed at him all day until late one afternoon in town, his temper finally broke. He had gone to the supply store when two ranchers from a neighboring spread leaned against the rail, grinning. "Heard your little helper's got more spirit than sense," one said crudely. "Pretty thing for a debtor's girl. Must be nice having her close at night." Elias didn't remember thinking, only the surge of red behind his eyes. The next second, the man was on the ground, blood streaming from his lip. "You don't speak her name again," Elias growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Not if you value your teeth." The fight left him bruised and bleeding, and by the time he rode home, guilt battled with rage in his chest. Clara met him at the barn, her face pale with worry when she saw the gash on his brow. "What happened?" she asked, reaching for a cloth. "Doesn't matter," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. But she caught his wrist, her fingers gentle yet firm. "You fought because of me, didn't you?" Elias hesitated. "They said things they shouldn't have," he admitted. "I couldn't let it stand," her throat tightened. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles." He looked at her then, really looked, at the fear, the shame, and the trembling kindness in her gaze. "Clara," he said quietly, "I didn't fight because I had to. I fought because I wanted to." The words hung between them, raw and trembling. She pressed the cloth to his cut, her hand brushing his cheek. The air between them was charged, fragile, alive. He caught her wrist, not to stop her, but to steady himself. "People will talk more now," she whispered. "Let them," he said, voice rough. They don't know you. They don't know the truth. Her eyes met his. And what is the truth, Mr. Grant? He didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the truth, dangerous and undeniable, was that the line between duty and desire had already blurred. Later, as he lay in bed with his jaw aching, Elias realized something he'd been denying for weeks. Clara Hale wasn't just working off a debt. She had become the light in his house, the warmth in his cold evenings, the reminder that love could still exist after loss. And though he swore to himself he'd keep his distance, his heart had already made its choice. The winter crept in slowly, frosting the fences in silver and turning the fields to quiet sheets of white. Life on the Grant Ranch fell into a steady rhythm. Mornings began before dawn, with the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting through the house, and ended with firelight and the low hum of men's voices after supper. Clara Hale had settled into her work with practiced grace, tending to the household, helping in the stables, and mending whatever time and labor had worn thin. But even as she grew comfortable with her days, her nights belonged to worry. Her father. It had been months since she'd left him, and though Elias had sent a few letters on her behalf, short updates carried by the mail coach, no reply had come. She told herself it was because he was too weak to write, that the cold had delayed post from town. But deep down, fear gnawed at her, constant and cruel. That fear found its voice one morning when Martha Jennings came hurrying from the main road with a letter clutched in her hand. "It's for you, dear," she said gently, her face grave. Clara's heart sank even before she unfolded the paper. The handwriting wasn't her father's. It was shaky, unfamiliar, written by the local doctor. Her fingers trembled as she read. Her father had taken a turn for the worse. The fever that had lingered since autumn had returned stronger, and though the doctor was doing all he could, he feared the worst. Clara felt her knees weaken. Elias, who had just stepped in from the barn, caught her before she fell. "Clara, what is it?" She handed him the letter, unable to speak. He read it in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. When he looked up, his voice was quiet but firm. "We'll leave at once." The journey back to the Hale farm was long and cold. Clara sat beside him on the wagon, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, but seeing nothing. Elias didn't speak much, he didn't need to. Every so often he'd glance at her pale face, wishing he could bear the weight of her sorrow himself. He'd seen loss before, but something about her grief felt sacred, fragile, untouchable. When they reached the farmhouse, the sight broke her heart anew. The roof sagged under the snow, the garden was buried, and smoke barely curled from the chimney. Inside, the air smelled faintly of herbs and illness. Thomas Hale lay in bed, thinner and weaker than she remembered. But when he saw her, a faint smile touched his lips. "Clara," he whispered. "You came home?" She fell to her knees beside him, clutching his hand. "I should have never left." "Hush now," he said, his voice fading like wind. "You did right. You survived. That's all I ever wanted." His gaze shifted to Elias, who stood quietly in the doorway, hat in hand. "You kept your word, Mr. Grant." Elias stepped closer. "Your daughter's done more than her share of the debt, sir. She's—" He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't betray the truth in his chest. "She's an honest worker. The best I've known." Thomas smiled faintly. "I see that." He looked between them then, at Clara's tear-streaked face, at Elias's stoic sorrow, and something like peace passed over him. "You'll take care of her," he said softly, though it wasn't a question. Elias nodded once. "On my life." That evening, as the last light faded, Thomas Hale slipped quietly from this world. Clara wept against Elias's chest, his arms holding her as though he could shield her from the ache of it all. Neither spoke for a long time. Only the sound of her sobs and the crackle of the dying fire filled the silence. The next morning, Elias buried Thomas himself, the frozen earth breaking beneath his shovel. Clara stood beside him, clutching her father's Bible. As the final handful of soil fell over the grave, she whispered, "I'll make you proud, Papa." Elias took her hand gently. "You already have," he said. When they rode back to the ranch, the world seemed different, quieter, heavier. A chapter had closed, and though Clara didn't know it yet, the one opening next would bind her heart to Elias's forever. The return to the Grant Ranch after her father's death was a quiet one. The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground, and the wind whistled through the bare branches like a mournful song. Clara Hale sat with her hands folded in her lap, numb and hollow, her father's old Bible clutched against her chest. The pages still smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, his scent. It was the only piece of home she had left. Elias Grant drove in silence beside her. He had buried many things in his life, dreams, friends, hopes, but watching her bury her father had unsettled something deep in him. She had wept with such quiet strength, never once asking for comfort, never collapsing completely. It made him ache to protect her, and yet he didn't know how. When they reached the ranch, the men greeted them with subdued nods. Martha had prepared soup and stoked the fire high, but Clara barely touched her food. She thanked Martha softly and excused herself, retreating to her small room. For the next few days, she moved through her chores like a ghost, efficient, polite, distant, Elias noticed. He always did. He found himself watching her from the corral, from the porch, from the doorway as she worked in the kitchen. Her eyes, once bright with quiet determination, were now shadowed with grief. He wanted to reach out, to tell her that he understood loss, that he too knew what it was to feel hollow. But every time he tried, the words withered in his throat. Martha, perceptive as ever, caught the tension immediately. "She needs time, Elias," she told him one evening as they stood by the fire. "You can't fix grief with kindness. Let her find her way through it." He nodded, but patience wasn't the problem. Fear was. Fear that if he spoke the truth, that he'd fallen in love with her, she'd leave. She deserved freedom, not a man twice her age who'd come to her home demanding payment. He told himself it was wrong to want her. She'd already lost enough. She didn't need his heart dragging her down. Weeks passed, and the distance between them grew heavier. Clara felt it too, that invisible wall rising again. She told herself it was for the best. Elias had given her shelter, work, and protection. She owed him gratitude, not affection. Still, sometimes she'd catch him watching her, eyes dark with some emotion she couldn't name, and her heart would stutter before she forced herself to look away. Then one morning, after a long silence, Elias approached her in the barn. His expression was tight, his words clipped. "Clara," he said, "the debt's been paid." She froze, a coil of dread tightening in her chest. "What do you mean?" "You've worked more than enough to cover what your father owed. You don't have to stay on here any longer. I'll pay your wages for this month and arrange your transport to town if you'd like to start fresh." For a long moment, she couldn't speak. His voice was steady, almost businesslike, but his eyes flickered with something she couldn't read. "You want me to leave," she said finally, the words trembling. "That's not what I—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "It's what's right. You've done your duty. You deserve your own life now." Her throat tightened painfully. "And what if I don't want to leave?" He took a step back as if distance could dull the truth. "Then you'll still have a home here, but not out of obligation." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp with things unsaid. She wanted to ask if he was sending her away because of the whispers, or because he'd grown tired of her presence. But pride, Hale pride, kept her silent. That night, as snow fell softly against the windows, Clara packed her few belongings. She couldn't bear to stay where she wasn't wanted. Each fold of her dress, each small movement, felt like a piece of her heart breaking loose. Elias stood outside her door for a long time, hand poised to knock, but he never did. Inside, Clara wept quietly, her tears falling onto the worn leather cover of her father's Bible. She didn't know it yet, but by morning, her decision would change everything and test just how much love a heart could hold before it shattered. The morning Clara Hale meant to leave the Grant Ranch. The sky turned the color of pewter, thick clouds pressing low over the hills, heavy with snow. The horses pawed the ground uneasily, sensing the coming storm. Clara stood by the barn, her carpetbag in hand, her heart heavier than the gray sky above her. She had told Martha she was leaving quietly before the ranch stirred awake. But it wasn't quiet. The wind howled like something alive, sweeping across the plains in long, mournful cries. Martha had tried to reason with her the night before. "Don't go in weather like this, child," she'd said. "You'll freeze before you reach town." Clara had only smiled weakly. "It's better to be cold on the road than to stay where I'm not wanted." Now, as she looked out over the drifting snow, doubt flickered in her chest, but pride burned stronger. Elias hadn't come to see her off. Maybe that was for the best. The wall between them had grown too high, too thick to climb over. She was just about to untie the horse when a shout carried through the wind. "Clara!" She turned sharply. Elias Grant was striding through the storm, coat flapping, hat pulled low against the sleet. His hair was dusted with white, his jaw set in something fierce. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. Clara's chin lifted. "I've paid my father's debt. You said so yourself. I didn't mean for you to go running off into a blizzard." He took a step closer, snow crunching under his boots. "You'll die out there." "I've survived worse," she said, though her voice trembled. Elias swore softly, frustration and fear twisting together. "Clara, stop being stubborn for 1 minute and listen to me." She flinched at the sharpness in his tone, but he wasn't angry at her. He was afraid. He could see it now, clear as day. The thought of her disappearing into that storm tore through him worse than any loss he'd ever known. When she didn't answer, he reached for her hand. "Please," he said quietly. "Don't go." The plea undid her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why should I stay when you've made it clear you don't want me here? You've been cold, distant, because if I don't keep my distance, I'll do something I can't take back," he cut in, his voice rough, raw. "I'll ask you to stay for me." The world seemed to hold its breath. The snow fell heavier, swirling around them like a curtain. Clara stared at him, heart pounding. "And what if I want you to ask me that?" He looked stunned, as though her words had struck him square in the chest. "Clara," his voice broke, "you deserve better than a man who came to your door demanding money. Better than a rancher with too much past and too little to offer." She shook her head, tears glistening on her lashes. "You offered me kindness when no one else did. You gave me a place to belong. That's worth more than any fortune." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the wind howled and the snow fell thicker, whitening the world around them. Then, slowly, Elias reached up and brushed the tears from her cheek with a gloved thumb. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She didn't. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Don't stop," she whispered. He kissed her then, slow, reverent, like a man finally letting go of years of restraint. The cold disappeared, the storm faded, and for the first time since they met, everything that had been unsaid was spoken without words. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling, not from cold, but from everything that had changed. Elias pressed his forehead to hers. "You stay here," he said quietly. "Not because you owe me, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I can't stand the thought of you being anywhere I'm not." Clara smiled through her tears. "Then I suppose I'll stay." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their hearts, something far gentler began to thaw. The blizzard raged for 2 days, sealing the ranch off from the world. The wind screamed down the chimney, snow piled high against the doors, and the sky stayed an endless, unbroken gray. Inside, though, something had changed. Clara Hale and Elias Grant worked side by side, hauling wood, tending the animals, cooking what they had, like they'd done 100 times before. Yet every glance, every brush of the hand carried a warmth that no fire could match. When the storm finally broke, sunlight spilled over a world remade in white. The air was sharp and clear, the kind of cold that bit but made everything gleam. Clara stepped outside, wrapped in Elias's old coat, her breath turning to mist. The ranch stretched before her like something out of a dream, quiet, safe, beautiful. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace. But peace on a ranch never lasted long. That afternoon, while Elias and the hands worked to mend a section of the north fence, Martha burst into the yard, shouting for help. Smoke was rising from the far pasture, the barn. Elias dropped his tools instantly. "Clara, stay here." But she was already running. By the time they reached the barn, flames were licking up the sides, feeding on dry hay and oil-soaked rags. The air shimmered with heat, and the horses inside kicked and screamed, trapped by the blaze. Elias cursed under his breath. "Get back!" he barked, grabbing a blanket and soaking it in the trough. "I can help!" Clara cried, trying to push past him. "No, you'll choke in there!" But she didn't listen. She tore off her coat, covered her face with her apron, and darted into the smoke. Elias shouted her name, but she was gone, swallowed by fire and shadow. Inside, the world was chaos, heat, smoke, and the terrified cries of horses. Clara moved by instinct, cutting ropes, slapping the flanks of panicked animals until they bolted toward daylight. Her lungs burned, her eyes watered, but she didn't stop. When the last horse stumbled free, she turned, and the beam above her gave a low, terrible groan. "Clara!" Elias's voice cut through the roar just as the beam collapsed. He threw himself forward, tackling her to the ground as it came crashing down. Sparks flew around them. Pain seared his shoulder, but he didn't care. She was alive beneath him, coughing, gasping for air. He dragged her outside just as the barn roof caved in behind them. The explosion of fire sent a wave of heat across the yard. The men poured buckets of water, shouting orders. But all Elias could do was hold her in his arms as the flames consumed what they'd built. When it was over, when the last hiss of steam rose from the charred remains, silence fell. The barn was gone. Several tools, the winter feed, all destroyed. But everyone was alive. Clara stirred weakly, her cheek pressed against his chest. "The horses?" she rasped. "They're safe," he said, his voice thick. "Thanks to you." She tried to smile, though soot streaked her face. "Guess I should have listened." He cupped her face in his rough, burned hand. "Don't you ever do that again," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't you ever run into fire without me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't just stand by. It's your home, Elias. It's ours now." The word ours struck something deep in him. He bent his head, pressing his forehead to hers, his voice breaking. "You're the only thing I can't afford to lose." That night, the two of them sat by the ashes of the barn, wrapped in a single blanket. The stars burned above them, bright and merciless. The fire had taken much, but in its place, it had left something stronger. They didn't speak of what came next, but both knew love had been tested in flame. And what survived was unbreakable. The fire had changed everything. In the days that followed, the Grant Ranch felt both wounded and alive, a place marked by loss, but still breathing. The men worked tirelessly to rebuild what the flames had devoured, and Clara Hale was at the heart of it all. She rose before sunrise, bandaged Elias's burned shoulder, and carried water and food to the workers without complaint. Her strength, quiet but steady, held the ranch together as surely as the nails and beams being driven into new walls. Elias watched her from a distance at first, his arm in a sling, his mind a storm of thoughts he couldn't put into words. He'd always prided himself on being a man of control, a man who kept his promises, who never let emotion rule him. But every time Clara smiled, or brushed her soot-dark hair back with that little absent gesture she always did, something inside him cracked wider. One evening, after the day's work was done, he found her sitting on the fence near the pasture. The sunset bled gold across the snow, and the horses, those same ones she'd saved, moved like dark shadows through the light. She looked peaceful, though a little tired, her hands folded in her lap. He approached quietly. "Martha says the men want to name the new barn after you." Clara laughed softly. "After me? I only did what anyone would have done." Elias shook his head. "No, most would have run the other way." "You ran straight into the fire." She turned to him, smiling faintly. "You would have done the same." He hesitated, then climbed onto the fence beside her. The silence between them stretched long but not uncomfortable. The air smelled of smoke and snow. Finally, Elias spoke. Clara, when I came to your father's house, I was just a man chasing a debt. Angry, bitter. I told myself I was doing what was fair, what was owed. But then I met you and—" His voice caught. "You changed everything I thought I knew about fairness. About grace." Clara's eyes softened, but she didn't interrupt. He took a slow breath. "You've paid that debt 100 times over, Clara, and yet somehow I find myself owing you more than I can ever repay." She blinked, tears gathering. "Elias!" He turned to face her fully, his gaze steady, though his heart was thundering. "I've lost barns, cattle, money, but I've never feared loss the way I fear losing you. When I saw you in that fire, I thought my heart had stopped. I don't ever want to feel that again." Clara's lips parted in a trembling smile. "You won't," she whispered. "Not if you'll have me." For a long moment, the words hung between them, soft and sure as falling snow. Then Elias slid off the fence and went to one knee in the snow-packed earth. He didn't have a ring, only a strip of leather from his glove, which he looped around her finger. "I don't have much to give," he said quietly. "But I can promise this. You'll never face another storm alone. Not while I've got breath in me." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks as she slipped down beside him, cupping his face in her hands. "Then that's all I need." He kissed her, gently, reverently, as the last light of day faded into the first pale shimmer of dawn. Behind them, the new barn's frame stood against the horizon, half-built but strong, a promise of what was to come. When they rose, hand in hand, the sun crested the hills, turning the snow to gold. Martha watched from the porch, smiling quietly to herself. The ranch had seen hardship, but this morning, it felt touched by grace. For the first time in years, Elias Grant wasn't haunted by what he'd lost, only grateful for what he'd found. And as the morning light spilled across the land, Clara rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Home." He smiled, his arm wrapping around her. "Always."